Here's everything you need to know about Swamp Thing. This is Nerdist Now. DC Studios co-CEO James Gunn, aka Revolver James Salat, gave us a lot to be excited about in his opening announcement slate for his regime of forthcoming movies and shows. From both a new Superman and a new Batman movie to finally a Green Lantern show, Gunn promised some heavy hitters. But for me, the one project that made me literally cheer at my desk was the last one, a new big screen Swamp Thing movie. You really can't do Gods and Monsters as Chapter 1 without including perhaps DC continuity's biggest, most important monster. And with Swamp Thing could come a whole universe of DC horror begging to hit the big screens. Gunn describes the project in the Swamp Thing portion of his announcement video as, quote, a very dark horror story and the origins of the monster who is Swamp Thing. And although it's tonally outside the rest of the DCU, it will still feed into the rest of the stories, unquote. This is a pretty exciting idea, a dark horror story that feeds into the DC movie and TV universe, which has a completely different tone. This is as it should be. Right from his beginning, Swamp Thing was an outsider, in some ways both a god and a monster. Over time, Swampy has intersected with major portions of the greater DC Comics universe and even joined the Justice League. Dark? But who is this protector of the green that could beat the hinges off of Superman? We're gonna get into it, but if you want to read more about it, Kyle Anderson has you covered over on Nerdist.com. Hey, I'm the one who's that. Also, not sure if we can spoil anything about Swamp Thing, but if you click this video by mistake, now's your chance to skedaddle on out of here. Go recycle.
Alec, let me go with you.
Now, there are a few different Swamp Things throughout comic history, but the version of Swamp Thing we're going to be talking about is Dr. Alec Holland, a brilliant scientist who had developed a new plant growth formula in the bayous of Louisiana. Unfortunately, rivals killed his wife and would have killed him too were it not for his body melding with the swamp and the formula and turning him into a giant mucky man. Who knew the Louisiana botany scene was so intense? Swamp Thing fought against all sorts of mad scientists and monsters, most notably his archenemy Dr. Anton Arcane and his unmen mutations. At the same time, Holland grew closer to Abigail Arcane, Anton's niece, and federal agent Matthew Cable, who had originally assumed Swamp Thing had killed Alec Holland. The story continued on for the rest of 24 issues, but ended unceremoniously. And that could have been it. One very 70s comic from 1972 to 1976. But in 1982, an up-and-coming grindhouse horror filmmaker named Wes Craven was making a movie based on the Swamp Thing. That movie is dumb and bad. But it did lead DC to relaunch the comic series. The Saga of the Swamp Thing, under writer Martin Pasco and artist Tom Yates, sadly did not live up to sales hopes either. Pasco brought back Abigail and Cable in the hopes of rekindling interest, but after 19 issues, he left the title. In a last-ditch effort, DC handed the reins of the series to a young British writer named Alan Moore. Moore had written for 2000 AD and Marvel UK to some acclaim, but had yet to pen his famous later works. Moore had complete creative control to revamp the series in any way he wished, along with artists Stephen Bissette and John Tottleben, and later Rick Veitch. Moore's 44-issue run turned Swamp Thing into something much more than a man-turned-monster. Right away, Moore established that Swamp Thing was not actually Alec Holland. Instead, he was an ancient, powerful entity in the swamp who merely thought he was Alec Holland following Holland's death. Moore would later reveal, in an attempt to connect back to the original one-off Swamp Thing story from House of Secrets, that there had been dozens, perhaps hundreds of Swamp Things since the dawn of humanity, like Santa Clauses. All versions of the creature were designated defenders of the Parliament of Trees, an elemental community also known as the Green, that connects all plant life on Earth, and later on other planets. It's pretty wild. But more than that, Moore made the Saga of the Swamp Thing a metaphysical, spiritual treatise on existence and love. He had Abigail and Swamp Thing's romance remain, even though he was no longer even tangentially human. At one point, vile racist Hicks, a favorite villain group in Moore's run, tried to put Abigail on trial for her unholy union with Swamp Thing, a direct allegory to attacks on interracial and homosexual relationships at the time. Eventually, Swamp Thing took over Gotham City to protest Abigail's treatment, and Batman himself would side with the Green Defender. After all, Superman's not human, and he's got a human girlfriend. Got him, Batman! 3 cheers for Batman! And while dozens of great writers and artists have worked on Swamp Thing titles in the years since, it seems almost assured that it'll be a mix of Len Wein, Bernie Wrightson, and Moore, Bissette, and Tottleben that will end up in the DCU's Swamp Thing movie. These are the most popular runs, but also the ones that best fit the horror inherent to the character. A man or not a man, becomes a monster and then learns what it means to be human while fighting off other terrors, both scientific and demonic. Gunn mentioned the Swamp Thing movie will tie in with other DCU titles and characters. This happened all the time in the comics. Swamp Thing interacts with Superman and Batman, fights Hawkman and Hawkgirl, teams up with Etrigan the Demon, the Phantom Stranger, and Deadman, goes into the spirit realm and meets the Spectre, and it even introduced the character of John Constantine. All of these, and indeed many, many more such characters, can and possibly will get their own movies and TV shows. This could even finally give us the Justice League Dark movie we've been wanting for years. The team consists of magic, mystical, and monstrous DC characters like Constantine, Zatanna, Deadman, Man-Bat, Dr. Fate, Madame Xanadu, and of course, Swamp Thing. At one point, Guillermo del Toro was in talks to make such a film. We'd still love to see that. Music video director Joseph Kahn even shared unused concept art for his version of the film in 2017. But in any permutation, a dark and magical team is a great way to distinguish the DCU from the MCU. The DCU has a real opportunity here to prove that horror can exist alongside more mainstream superhero fare. Gunn and Peter Safran are smart to recognize Swamp Thing as not merely a monster character, but one of the most popular and fascinating DC characters in the whole canon. There's a reason he's had movies and TV shows before, as recently as 2019. Announcing Swamp Thing right away allows for more horror to influence continuity. Vampires, werewolves, and zombies all exist via Swamp Thing. We may finally get big screen Clayface or Solomon Grundy, Blue Devil, Floronic Man, and more. DC Comics does horror very well, and I'm jazzed to see where this goes. But tell us, what do you think? Are you excited for a Swamp Thing movie that isn't terrible? Who's your favorite member of Justice League Dark? Do you remember the Swamp Thing cartoon and its terrible Swamp Thing rendition of Wild Thing? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching as always, and for the latest and greatest in Swamp Thing news, stay tuned to Nerdist.com.